As I sit here currently writing and eventually reading this script, I'm filled with ideas on how to open a video with such a bold claim. I would start by clarifying I have zero qualifications on being a YouTuber, a video or audio editor, and especially a FNAF lore theorist in a long-established community of heavy hitters. I have only been a long-time fan of the fandom, so to speak, when it caught my attention many years ago when I was a security guard myself for a time. I've not read the FNAF books myself, and only caught snippets of them listening to other theories. I have, however, played the first few games myself and watched or read theories for many years now. I'm also compelled to make this theory video regardless, as I have a feeling nobody else will cover this, and if I'm even close to being correct, I should put this theory out there for others to hear and consider before the new game, Secret of the Mimic, releases next year. I'm sure the title has grabbed a few people's attention enough to humor me. That seems how you're supposed to make a theory video from what I can tell, so let me elaborate on that title. William Afton is Edwin. A thought I've not been able to get out of my head since thinking it. A thought that first popped up after watching both the dual process theory and GT Live's recent thoughts on Rye Toast's theory about Golden Freddy. A thought that turned into the question I posed to you as you listened to me ramble on for the rest of the video. What if Edwin in the books was meant to be a stand-in for William, not Henry? What sounded preposterous at first has led me down a rabbit hole trying to find something to outright disprove this as impossible, but continually coming up short. In which I might clarify, this is less of a quote-unquote very well researched for weeks theory and more of a question or call for some of the lore sleuths in the community to correct me on this theory before the new game drops. Because if I am right, this would have major implications for Jackie, William, and Charlie's death that we would need to consider going forward. But before we go forward, I would like to reiterate that this is just a theory. I'm not saying that anything I say that follows as 100% fact, nor am I attempting to completely exonerate William of his genuinely heinous later actions. I just thought I would share how I myself now look at the story going forward until clarified by the next game or something being pointed out to me that makes this theory impossible. So to go forward, I would like to open the theory with a saying to help set the tone. The path to hell is paved with good intentions. This thought first entered my head upon realizing that in the games, we do not know definitively who bought out and joined who in the very beginning of this franchise. In the books, it's been assumed it is Henry via the character Edwin, but what if Edwin is supposed to represent William, and his story is what began his descent into madness? To briefly recap, Edwin is working at a factory he bought to continue producing his robotic vacuum cleaners, when, after slipping sales, he sells the company to Fazbear Enterprises. Not long after, they have him working on endoskeletons to modify them for mascot costumes Fazbear sends him to then turn into animatronics. As Edwin is becoming even more busy than before, he creates an endoskeleton that will mimic his son to keep him entertained while Edwin focuses on work. After his son is killed by a white van after running into the street for his ball, Edwin is overwhelmed and consumed by grief. The mimic continues to mimic his son, and in a fit of rage and overwhelming grief, he beats the mimic with a rod until he no longer has the strength to do so, pouring his agony into the mimic as he does so. Now, you might see where I'm going with this idea from the last sentence there. There are definitely more than a few instances of characters in agony in the books, to my understanding. But this is definitely one of, if not the, most well-known example of someone in agony pouring it into an object. All of this exposition done, we now arrive at my theory. William did not kill Charlie. The mimic did after he poured his agony into it, after the death of Dave, or the crying child. I can imagine I may have passed your suspension of disbelief, but allow me to explain my thinking here, as I've tried very hard for days trying to get this thought out of my head, to find something definitive that would make a parallel between William and Edwin impossible. But after all the reading I have done since, I can find no major contradictions that would prevent them from being connected. I will, however, explain a few of the minor inconsistencies between the two, or, at least in my opinion, how I believe these two are meant to be not perfect, but warped mirrors of each other. The first being their children. Edwin, in the books, has only one child. David, while William, in the games, has Michael, his oldest son, Elizabeth, his favorite daughter, and Dave, his youngest son, known as the crying child. While this would be a pretty major contradiction on its own, nothing in this franchise between mediums is exactly one for one. Take Vanessa in the movie. In the movie, she is William Afton's, or at least presumed until later movies possibly, only child. Or, in the books such as Tales of the Pizzaplex series, having characters completely absent from the games such as VIP. Needless to say, while I am nowhere near as knowledgeable about the books, having, not read them, I continually get the impression from others that details between mediums are rarely, if ever, one for one. But general story beats, scenarios, and characters stay largely the same. With all that being said, humor me as we at least assume the family setup between William and Henry are flipped between the Mimic story and the games, in that William in the games does have his 3 children and Henry his 1, where here in the Mimic story, William has his 1 and Henry would presumably have the 3. Before we continue, I do understand how frustrating at times it can be to talk about the difference in character between these two men, as before any tragedy took place, very little separated them, even to the point of being described as looking similar, both having brilliant minds for business and robotics, and both sharing the tragic loss of children. I do have a little note here, because I can't on the fly shoehorn this in. I've written down a possible note about how both men poured agony into objects over these deaths. So, I can't 100% guarantee that the parallel exists there, but I thought I'd at least point this out. These men are fundamentally linked with each other, and the story going forward. You can hardly talk about one without mentioning the other. Now, I'll try my best to explain my thoughts on Charlie's death, which, with this theory, I believe to be at the hands of the Mimic. The Mimic, mimicking William's frustrations towards Henry's negligent design, his resentment reaches a crescendo as he cries out. He wishes Henry would know his pain of losing a child to another's negligence. After the death of Dave, the crying child, William poured his agony into the Mimic by beating it with a metal rod, much like in the book. The Mimic, mimicking William now, drives to Fredbear's, kills Charlie by beating her like William beat the Mimic, and drives off. It is my theory that the events in the games went something like this. William Afton is a young, struggling inventor who, after patenting his robotic vacuum cleaner and being met with initial success, sales drop and he is forced to sell his company to Fazbear Enterprises, started by Henry, after being met with a moderate degree of success with his own animatronics line. William is at least slightly humiliated having to be bought out by Henry, but seeing his brilliance in robotics is able to largely put those frustrations to the side to learn and grow by working with Henry. All is going well for the two until a tragic accident where his oldest son, Michael, and his friends play a prank on his youngest son, Dave, by stuffing his head into the mouth of an active Golden Freddy animatronic. Dave has his frontal lobe crushed and is barely hanging on to life over the next few days or weeks, culminating in a very pivotal moment in the series. At his lowest point of sadness, anger, and agony as his child Dave is dying, William makes a seemingly simple yet devastating statement and plan in one line: I will put you back together. And he did. Which, here's where I should bring up another minor point of contention. In the story, it is said that Edwin runs away and disappears after the death of David, where, in the games, clearly William is still a part of Fazbear for many years to come after this point. Now, this is where I lean more into opinion, because there really isn't anything definitive to back this up, but I take this situation to be less literal and more metaphor in the games in a sort of Darth Vader kind of way. William, quote-unquote, leaves at that point by, in a way, having a part of him die with his son then and there as he makes that statement. The original William, quote-unquote, leaves by dying, to continue the Darth Vader analogy, and is destroyed by this new William in that moment. A William who would do anything, go to any length, make any sacrifice to fulfill his plan and promise. I will put you back together. I could also hammer in a thought of, think also perhaps like the character Lotso in Toy Story 3. Not only would it make much more sense for him to break in this way, rather than always being a monster under the surface, make it to his adult life, start a family, have a successful business, and nobody had any hint of a monster within him. Barring a few exceptions, that generally doesn't happen in real life. Horrible people have generally always been or done horrible things, or have some logical series of events that pushes them into horrible mindsets. Again, think like the governor in The Walking Dead or Lotso from Toy Story 3. It is a very rare circumstance that from birth, someone is a pure monster just underneath the surface and nobody in their lives into adulthood ever noticed, being the key point here. Not that it's impossible, I just get the sense that William wasn't born evil, but perhaps tragically, in the end, he chose evil. The last potential point of contention I can see with my limited understanding of the deep lore of FNAF is how exactly the Mimic would be the one to drive up to the side of Fredbear's, park the car, kill Charlie, and drive away. Because it's one thing for him to stand around the FNAF 2 location as we see with the pink guy, and it's a whole other thing for him to, as the Mimic, a robot, to be able to drive. Admittedly, this is where I really have to test your suspension of disbelief. I believe that since the Mimic's creation, it wasn't just mimicking Dave, but William as well. While not stated explicitly in the games or story of the Mimic, I can imagine William driving Dave and the Mimic between their home, factory, and Fredbear's, or anywhere Dave would have gone over that summer. As it is said in the story, David and the Mimic spent all their time together to the point of eating and even brushing their teeth together, which in the games would presumably happen at the sister location when Dave goes down to visit his father, if the wife and other children are occupying the house enough to maintain it, unlike the Mimic story. I believe the Mimic would still be made by William in the game's timeline, as Dave was the most energetic and the youngest of William's children who would have needed more attention, as Michael at that time would be shown to not be too fond of his younger brother, and Elizabeth was likely not very much older than Dave. Their mother certainly would have appreciated the extra help watching Dave, and William would have a chance to almost be in two places at once to help watch Dave and test both a new program and animatronic all at once. After Dave's death, however, the Mimic likely spent most of its time with William after that point. Now, in the Mimic story, it's stated 2 weeks pass before Edwin attacks the Mimic out of grief. I can also imagine during that time the Mimic is starting to observe and subsequently mimic William more, now that Dave is gone, culminating in his final observations of William brutally attacking it, and the pouring of his agony and resentment towards Henry. I think you might be starting to see where I'm going with all this. I believe it's at least possible in the game's timeline William had made the Mimic to be at least a rough animatronic copy of himself in appearance, as opposed to the pure endoskeleton we see the Mimic as in Ruin or in the book. I would point to how in Sister Location, which is generally understood now to be very early in the game's timeline, William was experimenting with realistic-looking animatronics. I believe William made the Mimic as one of these early prototypes, attempting to make a realistic copy of himself in the Mimic. Now, obviously the Sister Location animatronics came later, but the Mimic was just his initial trial run prototypes of what would come later of realistic, human-looking animatronics. This would help to explain how in Ruin the Mimic appears to have the remnants of a tuft of hair on its head. It is at this point when the Mimic still appears as William, but before having its appearance change, the Mimic, following its programming with William's agony guiding it along, drives to Fredbear's in William's car, sees Charlie outside, and kills her before driving back to William's house, which is where I believe it ties into the new character of Jackie the Clown. In the books, when the team from Fazbear comes to collect their property from Edwin for breach of contract, the Mimic begins to kill the team one by one, and it does so while quickly jumping between different costumes. This ability to change its appearance on its own volition is enough for me to suggest that at least perhaps after Dave's death in the games, William, not wanting to see not only a reflection of his old self, but the memories associated with it, and possibly to cover up evidence, converts the Mimic endoskeleton from a rough copy of himself to Jackie the Clown to be the third new animatronic performer of Fredbear, Golden Bonnie, and now Jackie the Clown, all performing at the carnival while William and Henry perform themselves on stage at Fredbear's. But this ability to change appearance on its own is what I believe may tie into the pink guy from FNAF 2, but more on that later. It's after this point where William goes further and further in his descent into madness and grief that he notices the puppet acting strange and eventually realizing it is possessed by the soul of Charlie, killed by the Mimic. With a glimmer of hope now right in front of him, he realizes he now has a viable way to fulfill his promise he made to his son now, with absolutely nothing holding him back. Again, the quote, "I will put you back together," which itself begins what I said in the beginning of this video. The path to hell is paved with good intentions. William was truly gone at that point, and his transformation into Spring Chap had begun. While I know this is a lot to take in and process, I would also like to throw out at least one thing I have even less evidence for, but can't shake now that I'm continuing down this line of thought. I would instead turn it into a question. What is the possibility that the pink guy from the FNAF 2 minigames is the Mimic reusing his appearance as William? Well, it would help to explain how there are two depictions of one character in a series where colors really do matter, but only after a nebulous point, apparently. I'm not solid enough in this idea to assert it quite yet without more thought and discussion, which I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of in the comments below. I would, however, point out that this parallel already exists with the Mustard Man, as called for many years, who everybody seems to be pretty much of a consensus that that is William. Ergo, though, that proves there's yet another different appearance of Williams in these little mini-games, who's generally understood to be the purple guy, but is also Mustard Man. I'm just saying, could also... It's odd there's so many different depictions of this one character. I would also point out that if the pink guy is supposed to be the purple guy, or William Afton, why are they presented as opposites? Well, think on that for a minute. Not just in appearance, but in words and actions. William is shown to be very eloquent, as shown in the opening of Sister Location when speaking to others. Pink guy says nothing. William is also generally shown as fairly animated and almost performative to others. The pink guy never moves and only observes. supposedly they're the same character, presented totally different in more ways than one in a series where character depictions and colors are very important, but again, only after this point, apparently. I don't buy it. So, to recap, Edwin in the Mimic story is a distorted stand-in for William and his early history with Fazbear Enterprises. The Mimic, mimicking William, while being fueled by his agony, kills Charlie while looking like, but not exactly, like William, which is mirrored in the depictions of Purple and Pink Guy. William takes the Mimic Endo out of his doppelganger appearance and puts it into a Jackie the Clown shell to perform at the carnival, and not be seen by William again, and very likely cover up the evidence. Now that we're at the end, I would like to reiterate I'm nowhere near as versed in the lore as many other established theorists are. I'm not making any of these statements as fact, only theory and opinion. I, at this stage, am not even all that sure about this myself, but I couldn't get it out of my head, and I needed to put it out into the ether before Secret of the Mimic drops in case I am onto something. If nothing else, I'd like this theory proven, without a doubt impossible, by the community, so there's some more solid footing going into the new game that can be expected from it. This is also not an exoneration of William, who in the end absolutely becomes an irredeemable monster, again, akin to, like, the governor in The Walking Dead. I just think how he became Springtrap was a little more complex than we might think. I'm kind of going off script here in the end, but I should also add, I tried to do all this in one take for the most part, and again, I have zero experience editing and making videos, so if there's a lot of stumbles or trips of words or what have you, I'm very much not used to this, and this might only be the one video I ever put out, because there's a few YouTubers I do want to send this to in particular, to get their take on it. Excuse me. But, you know, we'll see if anybody thinks I'm onto something here. So, I guess without further ado, thank you for watching. Correction to that. Having to come back to make a quote-unquote slight addendum to the end of my video here, as John FNAF just uploaded a video, and I thought, since he actually, coincidentally in his theory, is touching on what I was talking about earlier, some of the points he brings up I thought I would bring some counterpoints to. I'd say I agree with about 50-50 of his theory, where he leans more towards Henry in the beginning, but seems to end it with him not thinking it would be either William or Henry, whereas I do still think it was William that made the Mimic. And I just wrote down some bullet points to go down, and again, I'm going to try to sail through these to try and, again, keep a long video as little extra longer as possible. Grammar. First point, while Henry in the Silver Eyes does have a very similar backstory to Edwin, the actions of Henry in the Silver Eyes never seemed to match his character in FNAF 6 to me. Edwin turned to anger and rage as his immediate emotional response to the Mimic, mimicking David after his death. Henry in the games, however, seemed far more consumed by grief rather than anger or rage. So consumed by grief, in fact, it was his reasoning for being uninvolved with the events of the timeline between Charlie's death and FNAF 6. I find it more likely that William would be one to respond with a more violent reaction than Henry. Number 2, William would have a motive to capture the Mimic and keep it underground, just like Henry would. While we don't know exactly when the carnival shut down, it was shown to survive at least into 1983, coincidentally the same year that Charlie's death happened. If William was still active after 1983, when Henry became more and more suspicious of him as time went on, But before William was totally removed from Fazbear, at least as an overt owner, by 1987, it would not be a good look at all for him if Henry discovered the mimic endoskeleton made by William, even while looking like him for whatever reason from his perspective, even though it was the mimic mimicking William and not William himself, or him having the mimic do anything intentionally, let alone look like him, obviously, was responsible for his daughter's death. I find it entirely possible that at some point between 1983 and 1987, to tie up a loose end, William moved the mimic from the closing carnival, whenever the carnival closed exactly, and hid it in a side storage area in his underground facility seen in Sister Location and Ruin. It was only later when Cassie came through the wall from the basement of the FNAF 6 location on the other side that the mimic was freed from the Mexa's security system, also on top of after shutting down all the other Mexis nodes, which, while absolutely could have been expanded upon and improved by Cassie's father and Michael, Mexis had to exist in some form, quote-unquote, a really long time ago. I do not think Gregory or Vanessa made Mexis. And my final point number 3, and this is a brief one. The same way that Henry in the fourth closet gave his sister Jenny the task of keeping the mimic sealed after his death, William could also have given that same task to Michael, who, despite eventually finding out the truth about his father, could have continued ensuring the mimic stayed sealed, as we know the mimic was still dangerous. I believe Michael survived the FNAF 6 fire to continue keeping the mimic sealed, and was the one, along with Cassie's dad later, to expand the Mexis network to the Pizzaplex. This would also help to explain why there's an exact replica of his old room inside the Pizzaplex, a place for him to potentially covertly continue monitoring the mimic. That was all the extra counterpoints I had to make. I know there's no way John would ever see this, but I am glad he put out that video when he did, because I had some extra points to cover here. And again, he and anyone else or whoever else is free to disagree with me on this, and this is more my discombobulated thoughts being put out there so we can at least get the discussion started with what I've brought to the table here, and just making sure that all the little details that we can speculate on are ironed out before the next game comes, because, you know, we presumably still got some time until that happens. So, without further ado, hopefully for the last time for this video, thank you for watching.